to there being strong demand for housing in the future, and also that there's demand for greater choice and options. And so we recommend building neighborhoods that integrate multifamily and single family into a cohesive neighborhood. So that way parents with kids and grandparents and young people can all live together in a neighborhood and not separated out into different kinds of housing and different kinds of neighborhoods. And to do that, we really need to update the zoning districts, because even with the R7 district, you can do everything from multifamily, single family, but it's not really what it's intended for, and it's not really the optimum tool to do that. So one of the next steps you'll see is that we're looking at zoning code updates, and there's some model ordinances like a traditional neighborhood development district that we're looking at and could draw from. Recommendation 2 is to consider looking at accessory dwelling units. Those are also sometimes known as granny flats. So if you have a garage that's separate from the house, and you can retrofit that into a housing unit for maybe taking care of an aging parent or to generate some income for a family. That's been a policy that's been adopted by a lot of cities. Obviously, you would want to limit where they can happen and how they can happen so they don't overwhelm neighborhoods. That's something that's worth looking into to increase options and increase choices in neighborhoods. And here's an example of some multifamily housing that's designed to fit in with a more single-family neighborhood. So it doesn't have to be, a giant imposing structure. It can be something that fits in, especially when we're talking about building new neighborhoods and extending existing neighborhoods. And then next slide. These are some examples of those accessory dwelling units. So everything from something above a garage to a garage being retrofitted to more of a cottage in the backyard or in the side of a corner lot, for example. Next slide. So when we're talking about connectivity, we're talking about both encouraging a connected street grid, because what happens when you have a street grid that's not connected, you're forcing all your traffic onto your main arterials, and that can cause a lot of congestion, and it increases the distance of every trip that's taken, and it makes it particularly difficult to get around if you're on foot or on a bike. So implementing that would include looking at the subdivision regulations. Right now, there's a requirement to do a connection every half mile along an arterial, and that's something that we'll want to look at. Recommendation 2 is about, okay, you have the street pattern. What kind of facilities do you have on the street pattern? And we would recommend a sidewalk network and strengthening the sidewalk network. And places that are already existing, you can look at doing incentives for replacing sidewalks, where there's a lot of programs like Safe Routes to School for paying for sidewalks. And also when you have new areas, you can require sidewalks with the subdivision regulations again. So recommendation 3, particularly on major intersections, looking at putting pedestrian signaling and crosswalks. Some intersections have that, some intersections don't currently. And then to take a step further, recommendation 4 is consider adopting a complete street policy, which allows the city to really declare and be explicit about its intent to encourage walking and biking in neighborhoods. Next slide. So this is an example of what we're talking about when connecting a street grid versus not connecting a street grid. And next slide shows the kinds of facilities, sidewalks, especially along arterials and the neighborhood collector streets as well. Next slide. So strategic initiative 3 is about those neighborhood centers. And a neighborhood center is where you have a major intersection, and you can encourage through land use and zoning to have the kind of retail and services for neighbors. And it's very important to work with those nodes to make sure that they're coordinated, to do things like share parking, limit number of curb cuts, signs and buildings on the street, encouraging infrastructure improvements such as sidewalks, so that you really have that pedestrian neighborhood center environment instead of uncoordinated development, which I'll show in a minute. And recommendation 3 is also going along with that, making sure your landscape standards are improved is about how a coordinated community center looks like versus an uncoordinated development where every site has its own internal circulation and its own parking. If you bundle those things together, you can have a much more pleasant environment, especially in a neighborhood setting. Next slide. And so here's just a draft of the land use plan, and I won't go into this for time, but we're starting to identify where those neighborhood centers could occur with those orange boxes. Next slide. So initiative number 4 is about the process and coordinating development infrastructure and services. So we know that Enid is growing and there's going to be a higher demand for multifamily units. And if you build it in a way that those units are integrated into a neighborhood, a variety of housing choices, and you coordinate your community centers, you're going to end up with a much more efficient use of land, and each mile or unit of infrastructure that you build is going to serve more housing units and a higher dollar value of development. So what that means is that you can raise your standards for development, and that those costs are spread out over more people. So it's not prohibitively expensive to do these kinds of things when it's done in conjunction with new development and growth. So the first recommendation is about using infrastructure to support development. Recommendation 2, at the same time that you're doing that, you can raise the minimum standards. So recommendation 1, think about it like when you're building your trail network, you're not just building the trail connection, you're also building an incentive for somebody to do really high quality development along that trail connection. At the same time, raising the minimum for everywhere. Recommendation 3 is about investing in where you already have your existing services, so not leapfrogging out into the country, but keeping things close to where you already have services. And then number 4, it's not just about retail in neighborhood centers, it's also about services such as parks or police or fire or offices. It doesn't have to be just retail centers. Next slide. And the final recommendation is about stabilizing those existing neighborhoods. So in some areas, vacant lots have become a problem, and we have some strategies which on the next slide I will explain how to deal with some of those vacant lots. Encouraging new infill housing can be done really effectively through the nonprofit community and partnering with them, whether they're community development corporations or community financial institutions. And promoting preservation of those existing assets, like Vincent mentioned, and developing property maintenance programs like minor home repair. And so the final slide is about some of those strategies to mitigate vacant lots. For time, I won't really get into this, but you can see stormwater and community gardens can really have a real impact where you have a lot of vacant lots. And next slide.
All right, we're going to talk then about, is there any questions for Zach about model neighborhoods he presented?
I have a question.
There.
Explain the pricing points. That was on the very first slide.
Zach, can you explain the pricing points that was on the first slide?
Price points, so different prices for rents or for mortgage payments on housing. So instead of having income neighborhoods, is what we're talking about.
Houses for 100,000 and 200,000, and potentially rental property as well, all co-located.
One question on the mixed housing neighborhoods. Our experience with that has been that the private home neighborhoods don't want apartments built in their neighborhood. How do you overcome that?
Well, I think what we're talking about here is generally new developments, where you're going to do that intentionally so that people buying a house understand what they're buying into.
Well, my concern is that of course, we're also restricted on what the developers and builders want to build. I mean, we can't necessarily tell them, we can tell them what we prefer, but they're still going to build what they think they can sell and make the most money.
Right, and we think that there's some zoning techniques we can use to make this a process where the developers will want to do this. Probably will be required, it will be a greenfield development most likely, where this would have to start, where a developer would be would know that he was building all of that, and the people buying there would know that they were buying all of that. So we're not trying to say, let's just go into an existing neighborhood where there's a vacant lot and put up a multifamily house in that vacant lot. This would have to be an intentional strategy with an intentional background to it through the zoning ordinances.
And as a developer who's actually done some of these projects like this, I will tell you, they're actually quite popular, and for developers, we found them very useful because no matter who walks in the door, it's actually, you do have a product that they may be able to fit. And frankly, I think if it's done properly, and especially if you can incorporate a little retail with it, it does create a true community. And in general, most people seem to like that.
All right, well, we've got a limited amount of time. Let's talk a little bit about industrial. We have the 6 initiatives. I will read these to you right now. The long-term water supply, of course, the city right now is soliciting proposals from engineering firms to look at the long-term water supply of bringing water from COG to the city. And so I won't elaborate on that. This just simply states that that is something that needs to be looked at closely to see if that's the right thing to do, given getting the Arkansas River water rights and the Powell Reservoir storage rights. I won't elaborate on that, but that will require changes to the distribution system, which is why we put that as strategic initiative number 2. Believe that the treatment plant would best be suited where it's visible from the industrial partners that you might be bringing in, so that they know that they have water, because we believe that's one of the key elements of bringing people in for industrial development, so that they can see their water supply. So located on the east side, but that will require that we'll have to do a transmission main across to existing plant number 1 and probably install a pump station at plant number 1. So this gives you a little diagram. We just picked the location. This is not the set location for this treatment plant. It's just a location that makes sense on the east side of town at 66. Bringing a transmission main across and connecting it into the existing water plant, and then from that plant connecting to the west pressure zone, which begins at Chestnut and Cleveland. And so that would provide water from the Powell Reservoir to the west pressure zone that's from Chestnut and Cleveland, and then goes on to the west. And hydraulically, it looks like this is what will be required. That's a fairly good sized pipeline, just preliminary sizing, somewhere in the 36 to 48 inch size for that pipeline to bring that water across. Depending upon, we're assuming that the city would like to make it so that in an emergency, the city can be supplied with water without using the well fields. So that's one of those things that the study that's coming up will have to determine is how much do we want to allow for that, and by using the distribution and transmission that we have shown here. Strategic number 3, of course, is to increase your sanitary sewer collection and ensure the trunk lines are planned to size for that. The biggest thing for this is the existing force main at 54th and Market. We want to look at that. There are actually 2 force mains that extend from there, and one of them is not in use. There's 8-inch and 12-inch. One of them is not in use, so we think there is some additional capacity there that we can use that as the trunk line. And so when we diagram that, if you look, you'll see there are 3 potential, the dark green lines are potential sanitary sewers to serve industrial areas. That water treatment plant location that I showed just as a placeholder is shown there. We need the sewer run to it anyway, and so that might be a good basin to bring sewer up that doesn't already have sewer. Most of that would connect to the pump station 54th and Market, look at that capacity, and then use that to come over to the sewer plant. The one going up in the to the far left, that one probably could be connected without using a lift station.